think if we want that big change to happen, it's not just about what is the big change, sit in a room, come up with a policy idea, write a manifesto. It's about like, how does that interact with the people that are actually going to do the doing? Because for me, like, the policy change is not a sport where someone announces something and you think you've won. For me, it's more visceral than that. And you've got this trade-off of, do we, schools, everybody in schools is overworked. Do we want to ask them to collect more data just so that nerdy people like me can play around with spreadsheets and in 3 years' time tell them how to do tutoring better? Or do we want to let just sort of trust schools to know this stuff? I mean, I'm from a research background, so I'm always, please can I have the data? But it's a tricky one. And I don't know that we're set up at the moment to have the data we would need to get the answers we would want, which I think is a shame.
That is honestly one of the best things we've ever had on this podcast. That was such a beautifully passag kind of, the wording of that is just, you can absolutely see Miss Richards sitting there sort of silently seething in her classroom, writing this letter, sort of beautifully eloquent and very well targeted, I'm sure, to a 15-year-old.
Hello and welcome to the Qualified Tutor podcast, the podcast that brings you the latest in the world of tutoring, edtech and education, and hopefully inspires in you the big change that each and every one of us is capable of. Qualified Tutor is an industry-leading tutor training organisation and online tutoring community for thousands of tutors around the world. This podcast is the voice of this community, where we aim to hear from tutors, teachers, entrepreneurs, coaches, business experts, students, tutorpreneurs, and more from the world of tutoring about what inspires them every day, how they can help tutors like you, and what they've learnt about tutoring along the way. The question is, what will you learn today?
Hello and welcome to the 147th episode of the Qualified Tutor podcast. My name is Ludo Miller, the host of this podcast. Welcome back to our regular listeners. Welcome to any of you for whom this is your first time listening to the Qualified Tutor podcast. And of course, a huge, huge welcome to today's guest, Ben Gadsby. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
It's a real pleasure to speak to you here today. I know that you met some of my colleagues at the recent National Tutors Summit in London. I know that was a great time for them. I hope it was also a good day for you as well, Ben, was it?
Yeah, it was a great day. It was so nice to be in a big room with lots of people again after the last couple of years.
Yeah, and you had the pleasure of speaking as well, didn't you?
Yes, well, you say that. It was a very scary panel. I was on the same panel as an actual experienced head teacher and a professor, which is somewhat daunting. And they made me speak last when all the good points had been taken, but I think I got away with it. But
no grudges being held there.
No, not at all.
Well, for those of you who had the misfortune of not being able to attend that summit that was hosted jointly by a number of organisations, Impetus being one of them, and Action Tutoring and a couple of others as well, Nesta. Ben is the head of policy and research at Impetus, a wonderful UK-based charity that transforms the lives of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, crucially, by ensuring that they get the right support they need to succeed in life, in work, in their career, and in whatever aspect that they require support in. So Impetus have done a lot of work, and specifically for the tutoring industry. Many people will know Impetus from the first couple of rounds of the National Tutoring Programme, in which Impetus, along with a couple of those other organisations I mentioned, were crucial to the delivery and the design and the implementation of that. So we may talk a little bit about the NTP a little more over the next half an hour or so. But Ben is also an associate fellow at Bright Blue, which is a kind of liberal conservative think tank who do a lot of work on government policy. So Ben has a couple of varied roles, and really, as I mentioned, his work on the NTP. Ben has also been a policy officer at Teach First and an education researcher supporting the UK government on their kind of key education policy issues. So there really are very few, I'd say, with the same expertise in educational policy as Ben. So, Ben, thank you very, very much for joining us. Now, regular listeners will know that we like to kick off these episodes with a little segment where we take ourselves back to the childhood days, the school days of our guests. Now, I asked Ben, as I ask so many guests, if they could find some old school reports that they might be able to talk about. As so many other guests, I think locating old school reports is increasingly harder the older you get. But Ben, you did find another little piece of gold dust. Is that right?
Yeah, I knew I still had this. I didn't know where it was, so it did take me a little bit of time to find, but I found it. But I found a letter from my old science teacher, Miss Richards, that she wrote me when I was in year 11, when I was being probably a bit too stroppy towards a different senior teacher and causing all sorts of problems. And the letter is full of good advice that I think is, it's good advice, but also I think gives you that sense of possibly what kind of teenager I was, with the caveat that I hope I'm a better person now. That's always the aim, right? Everybody wants to have learned things compared to when they were 15. Do you want me to give you the advice from Miss Richards?
I don't think we could continue without it.
So the letter says, questions to be considered silently, capital letters double underlined, by an angry young man. Question 1. Have you made your point, although others may not have agreed with you? Question 2. Have you anything to gain, either for the cause or personally, by continuing to make the same point in the same way? Question 3. What have you achieved? Brackets positive. Question 4. If you were Mrs. Voivodka, could you deal with this point better, and how? Question 5. Take a deep breath, think of chocolate, lose the anger. Logically, capital letters double underlined again. Logically, how do you save face and sustain no further personal damage? Leave them considering your point, not your actions. A wise man once said, if you lose your life for your principles, there is nobody left to fight for them. Mr. P. Richards, brackets, Dad. So that was the letter from Miss Richards. I didn't get expelled, for anybody wondering what kind of terrors I'd been up to. But lots of good advice there, I think, for policy people in general. Like a lot of us, I think, are passionate, particularly at 15 when you're not as good at controlling your emotions. A lot of us are passionate about things. Some good advice there in terms of thinking about how you make the change that you want to happen, making it happen, rather than being kind of overly focused on just kind of expressing your kind of frustration, disappointment, whatever it is you're feeling at the time. So yeah, Miss Richards should probably try and find. I haven't seen her for years. Like this letter is like 15 years old, but I've kept it, and I'd like to think I've learned from it. And yeah, like I said, I knew I'd kept it because it was a really meaningful letter, and it did change. I think it changed how I approached the rest of that problem.
That is honestly one of the best things we've ever had on this podcast. That was such a beautifully passag kind of, the wording of that is just, you can absolutely see Miss Richards sitting there sort of silently seething in her classroom, writing this letter, sort of beautifully eloquent, and very well targeted, I'm sure, to a 15-year-old. Yeah, that is really, that had me in stitches. So
I don't think she meant it to be funny on a podcast 15 years later. I don't imagine when she wrote it, she was thinking that this would end up being one of the uses.
I'm sure she meant no other eyes to see it or ears to hear it. So, Ben, I mean, you've sort of touched on there about the effect it might have had on you, but why are you a policy and educational policy and researcher? What drove you to go into that?
Yeah, I mean, I was really lucky at school that I had like a number of kind of good teachers that looked out for me. It's always slightly awkward. I've always lived in fear of having to talk about one of them because there are so many people that like, I remember kind of conversations or advice or lessons or whatever it was that have kind of shaped me. And I've always felt really lucky at school. So I went to a good but not like exceptional, particularly kind of state school, in a kind of middle class area, kind of in Essex. And about 80% of the kids at school were kind of pretty middle class from the middle class town. But about 20% of us travelled in by bus from kind of nearby towns, kind of more working class areas. Usually we had like kind of aspirational parents who didn't want us to go to the schools in our own towns, but thought that, you know, send us across to the neighbouring town to the better school. And I guess I got this weird experience at school where I had this real sense of how different people's backgrounds played out, even in the same school with the kind of the same teachers and the same lessons, in terms of how people kind of approached life, you know, the kinds of, you know, come back from the summer holidays and what have people done over the summer holidays kind of stuff. But even like thinking about university applications. And I remember my best friend at secondary school, Emma, when we were thinking of applying to university, you know, obviously finances and budgeting and working out what you can afford is a kind of big part of that. And Emma was kind of super smart, and she could have gone to any university she wanted to. And I remember we'd gone to look at Sussex University, and, you know, South Coast, relatively expensive. And she'd added it all up and she was like, I couldn't afford, on the kind of maintenance loan and stuff, I can't afford to go to Sussex with how much the kind of student accommodation is. The only place I can afford to go is Bangor in Wales. And no kind of discredit to Bangor at all, which I'm sure is a lovely place. But like, it was the first time I'd really come across somebody having to make, like, you know, growing up, you always think, oh, I'm going to work really hard at school, I'm going to go to the best university I can. Like, nobody, or certainly I didn't grow up thinking that like finances would need to be a kind of a major factor in the decision-making process. But it was for Emma. Fortunately, somehow she made it work. I mean, she got 3 A's at A level. She went to Sussex. She went on to become a teacher, and she's brilliant. But for me, it's always been kind of really visceral, and it's really interesting because usually, like, I get asked, "Oh, what does Impetus do? Can you talk a bit about what Impetus does?" And, you know, we're very statsy, datary people, and it's all, you know, oh, young people from disadvantaged backgrounds are only half as likely to get key GCSEs, and that's true. But like, it's just very dry. And for me, you know, I wasn't a disadvantaged young person. Emma probably wasn't. She might have been near the borderline. I don't really know. But I guess I've always had this sense of, firstly, the importance of kind of education and the value you get from teachers, but also the extent to which kind of different people's experiences of that play out differently based on their circumstances. So for me, I've always had this question for, you know, as long as I can remember, like, how do we change that? And I guess as somebody that was also politically interested, the best answer I ever came up with is, you know, you can be an individual teacher and maybe touch, you know, dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of lives over a career. But actually, the real change is the large scale change, like the National Tutoring Programme. And you have to be looking at, like, what are the big structural things that we want to do differently. And increasingly, as my career has gone on, I've come to recognise that the two alternatives there, they're not really alternatives, because actually whenever somebody in Whitehall pulls a lever, someone somewhere is doing some delivery, right? Like, there's always teachers or tutors or whatever at the end of the kind of the chain of reasoning that have to do something they weren't doing before or do something differently. And I guess I'm increasingly interested in that kind of overlapping bit of the Venn diagram, where those kind of big policy changes that you might read about in a newspaper, or discuss on a podcast, where they kind of match up with the kind of the delivery and what's happening on the ground, and how those two bits kind of fit together. Because I think if we want that big change to happen, it's not just about what is the big change, sit in a room, come up with a policy idea, write a manifesto. It's about, like, how does that interact with the people that are actually going to do the doing. Because for me, like, the policy change is not a sport where someone announces something and you think you've won. For me, it's more visceral than that.
So Ben, you know, you're currently well in the sphere of education policy in this country. What is the latest thinking on how policy can be shaped to improve or to include tutoring as part of the school's armoury? What is going on with tutoring in schools at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, the tutoring stuff's been really interesting. I mean, it came from, you know, the pandemic here. Everybody started working from home. It was not obviously in schools as much, but like the rest of us with office jobs, you know, all started working from home. And after a couple of weeks of like, okay, we now know how Zoom works, there was this big question of, oh God, like, what are we going to do about the kind of the challenges facing schools? And the tutoring stuff and the National Tutoring Programme really emerged from that. And it was inevitable, I think, given school closures and immediate response, that like the first early stages of that were what can actually be done quickly, like what's actually feasible. But I think what's really interesting as it starts to settle down is there's a quote from Professor Dylan William that I really like, which is basically, he says, nothing works everywhere and everything works somewhere. Like the key question is what's going to work here in these circumstances. And the interesting thing about the sort of the evidence on tutoring is there's lots of evidence about tutoring, which is how we ended up with the national tutoring program. And there are lots of different models of tutoring that have been shown to work in some circumstances. You can use volunteers, you can use teachers, you can use teaching assistants, you can do 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 1-to-3 group size. You can do it in person, you can do it online, you can do weekly longer sessions, you can do more frequent shorter sessions. There are lots of kind of proven models in certain circumstances, but what I don't think we necessarily have yet is a clear sense of that. How do we pick what will work in these specific circumstances? A lot of the evidence comes from the US. And again, I think the US is leading the way on this. There's a research program. I think they're spending about $10 million or something. They're studying sort of 31 different ways of doing tutoring. So they're not just funding sort of tutoring as a kind of an intervention, thinking of it as an answer. They're very much thinking of it as an opportunity to kind of try different stuff and investigate this. But I still feel like we're at that stage now where the evidence on tutoring is really strong. We know tutoring works when it's done well, and we know like what some of the key elements of that are. Trained tutors, your links to schools, tracking your outcome data. But what we don't really have yet is the ability to tailor that and say, help schools to say, okay, for this specific group of young people in front of me, this is the best way of approaching tutoring for them. And I think that's the thing that hopefully we can start to unpick over the next couple of years as we kind of hopefully all draw breath and move into this kind of post-pandemic kind of normal with the national tutoring program winding down and hopefully more tutoring happening in schools than it was 5 years ago.
Absolutely. But I'm not going to let you just say that, Ben. What then needs to be done? What is the next step to overcome that final barrier that you just said there about schools not knowing how best to implement all of these models, the range of models, with the students in front of them?
So the big thing for me is data. I think there's been a real sense over the last couple of years that, schools have been under a lot of pressure. Some of the early rollout of the national tutoring program wasn't always as helpful for schools as it could have been. There's been a real push from schools, I think, to say, make this as simple as possible for us, please. And actually, I worry that we are missing the opportunity to collect the data on, which young people are being helped, which subjects, what group sizes are you using, what are you finding helpful? Because what we really need is there's so many different models. I mean, when you think about the kind of the academic mentors piece of the national tutoring program, that's one piece. Within the tuition partners, I think there's about 60 approved tuition partners for schools to use now. Plus there's schools obviously using their kind of own staff and implementing their own models. But nobody is really systematically kind of capturing that data so that we can look at it and investigate those things. And I think that's a real missed opportunity. And it's a hard one because someone somewhere's got to actually collect that stuff. And in lots of cases, it probably ends up being schools, right? And you've got this trade-off of, do we, schools, everybody in schools is overworked. Do we want to ask them to collect more data just so that nerdy people like me can play around with spreadsheets and in 3 years' time tell them how to do tutoring better? Or do we want to just sort of trust schools to know this stuff? I mean, I'm from a research background, so I'm always, please, can I have the data? But it's a tricky one. And I don't know that we're set up at the moment to have the data we would need to get the answers we would want, which I think is a shame.
With thanks to our sponsors this week, Newman Tuition and their founder, Zach Newman.
Hi, this is Zach from Newman Tuition. Educating young people and helping them to fulfill their potential is one of life's great joys. If you are a high-caliber individual who shares our passion for teaching, then we would like to hear from you. We are committed to gathering together tutors who have strong academic records, an enthusiasm for teaching, and excellent interpersonal skills. This is why we seek only the best tutors to join our network and why we are recommended by the Good Schools Guide. To join our team or to find out more, please visit newmantuition.co.uk.
Ben, lots of our listeners, lots of people in our community have an interest in the NTP and its success. They may not be involved in it, actively, but they have an interest in seeing how the general tutoring in schools conversation is going. What can you sort of tell them, Ben? What do you see as the future of tutoring in schools? Both what you've heard on the ground, but also more of a vision-wise, Ben. What do you see as the ideal model for tutoring in schools kind of moving forwards?
So for me, the ideal would be, tutoring is a tool for teachers, right? So the single most important thing is that schools should have tutoring available as a tool in their toolbox to use and deploy as they need. And part of the rationale for the National Tutoring Programme is that hasn't always been available in lots of places, certainly outside London, where schools have needed it. I think it was the Bradford opportunity area at one point had recognised that tutoring would really help boost academic attainment, and they were scouting around trying to kind of find some organisations to deliver some tutoring in Bradford as part of the Opportunity Areas programme, and they just couldn't find it, and that's a kind of a common problem. There was a scheme at the end of the Blair government that gave schools money for this kind of thing. A load of the money had to be given back because nobody could find the tutors. So for me, it was about how do we make that available to people so that it's there for people to use it. And the long-term vision for the National Tutoring Programme was effectively, it was a bridge. It was how do you stimulate the market, get schools kind of over that hump of, oh God, we're going to do tutoring. We're going to need to go out and find people. What does it look like? We're going to have to do a load of research about it. We're probably the only people doing it. Who do we talk to for advice about this? So the whole point of National Tutoring Programme was to kind of bridge that gap so that you go from an environment where people like me go, tutoring's really proven, do more tutoring, please, through to an environment where schools have got that in their toolkit. So that's the kind of the vision in the long term. I think you probably always want some element of DFE subsidy for it, if only to signal quality. There are so many different kinds of tutoring and tutoring organisations out there. I think it's helpful to schools to have someone doing a bit of kind of first line quality assurance and saying, you know what, these are gold standard, and if you use them, you'll get 10% off or whatever it is. But that long-term vision would be a kind of tutoring that is available so that when a teacher, a head of department, or whatever goes, I've got a group of students that need some tutoring, they can go out and they can find that tutoring that works for them. That's the hope. Whether we're on the journey to actually achieving that, open question. We're making progress, but we're not there yet.
But you have confidence for 2023, do you?
Yeah, I think as things have settled down, I think we're all 100% confident now that schools are not going to be closed again. It all seems to have started to bed in. I think there was the problem last year with the kind of the contractor for the tuition partners piece, Randstad. I think was universally agreed by pretty much everybody involved. As I probably have to be careful not to accidentally libel them here, but I didn't hear many people saying good things about Randstad. That's factually true. I can't be sued for that. The government recommissioned the contract with it, and it's with Tribal now. And I hear much better things. I think the challenge for schools, as always, is we know funding is a real issue for schools. It was really interesting. Rishi Sunak made that speech recently where he kind of talked a bit about education, and the kind of the maths to 18 bit got all the headlines. But it was really interesting when he said that, education's really important to me. All of the chances I've had in life have been because of education. Literally the first thing he said after that is, that's why we've announced more money for schools. You can tell the government is on the defensive about the school's funding point. But it's really tough in schools at the moment. And, I speak to kind of tuition partners that are delivering, and, renewals this year, schools were renewing, but with fewer pupils than last year because, the subsidy's going down, there's less money, they've got to find more money. And actually the trade-offs there are very real. And I think that's the challenge over the next couple of years. Again, a minister stands up, a Rishi Sunak stands up and says, by 2024, we'll have put X billions of pounds extra into the thing. And the IFS says, we might be back to the spending levels we were at in 2010 if we're lucky. But it's tricky for schools. And tutoring at the moment is one of those things I worry that it's seen as a nice to have rather than being seen as a kind of a core part of the kind of how we boost attainment in school.
A must have, yeah. I'd love to have it feels like this would be a really nice conversation to sort of have every Monday morning, weekly. Ben, your kind of key take on the latest in education in this country for our listeners. I think that you're giving really nice, very, very topical kind of the latest news on that. And I think that is an amazing purpose that Impetus serves, and also, a purpose I hope that this podcast serves as well for you listeners. So kind of, I guess what you're saying really is that, that we haven't reached the perfect set of policy, and it is really up to the researchers and a lot of the policymakers to create policy that fits in with the fact that there is no government money to spend. And it's all very well and good saying, well, the answer is that we need more government money. But if we know that isn't going to happen quickly, then the research and the policy has to create solutions that are less cost heavy.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of chicken and egg to it as well, because one of the problems, so I appreciate, I'm about to get very nerdy about government stuff, and apologies if this bores listeners to tears, but the DfE doesn't control how much money it gets. So the DfE has to ask the Treasury for the money. And most people at the Treasury go, what are you going to spend it on? And is it value for money? So the DfE spends an enormous amount of time saying to the Treasury, and, we had this when we were setting up the National Tutoring Programme, with this amount of money and we're going to do this with it. And the Treasury kind of pokes it and goes, that doesn't sound very effective. What's the evidence that's going to work? So actually, when I sit here and go, please, can I have a spreadsheet full of data? The spreadsheet full of data is also helpful for generating the evidence that means the Treasury go, all right, you can have a little bit of extra money then. Because otherwise, the only reason the Treasury gives anyone extra money is the politics of it all, and it's who shouts loudest. And actually, schools, to be fair, do a pretty good job of shouting pretty loudly, but are always going to be behind, the health service or whatever for kind of people's priorities. For me, the thing that was most interesting actually about Rishi Sunak's speech was the headlines, and even the national newspapers headlined the maths to 18 bit. But Rishi Sunak tweeted a graphic with the 5 key pledges from the speech. That wasn't one of them. There was no education in that kind of 5 key points. The education stuff is kind of really important to ordinary people, but for some reason it just never quite makes it into the top tier. And I do worry that if we don't sort of generate more evidence, when the funding situation is tight, we're always going to be in the second tier of people getting money, and not the first tier in the way that I certainly think we should be as a sector. Really, really powerful stuff there, Ben. I think that's a bit of a rallying cry to those listening. That have I managed to make research sound worthwhile and interesting?
Oh, I won't go that far, but you've certainly, I'm sure you've won over some supporters there for the research, the cause of research and in education. Because I was talking to my colleague, the founder of Qualified Tutor, Julia Silva, this morning, about how we were actually talking exactly about the Annenberg Institute US study that's just been published about around the kind of Biden education recovery plan, and how that they've just set up the NPSS, the National Partnership for Student Success, over in the US to take that research, take the money, and build something effective. And we were talking about how they've shown that tutoring is effective, which is what Bloom did in the 1980s. That was the last big research that people reference was, tutoring or small group, education can have X number of months, positive impact. And that's really what the Annenberg Institute have found, is that across, differing, depending on your grade level, it can have from 3 to 15 months improvement on a student's academic progress, one-to-one or small group tuition. So that is great research, and that will be referenced again and then, and the government can't sit there and deny that research. So it's good to see, Impetus, you guys have been banging the drum for years and years and continue to do so. So Ben, we would love to talk about this for much longer, and as I said, I'd love to get you back on just every few weeks and just tell us all what we need to know about the latest in research and in education. But
this is an opportunity to plug my newsletter. I do a monthly roundup of not newsy stuff, but so it's called Impetus Insights. You can sign up on the Impetus website, impetus.org.uk, and it's a mix of kind of research and a little bit of commentary on kind of what's been going on and stuff. And it's designed to be not newsy, like if you want news, we've got 2 excellent sector newspapers, but give a bit more kind of some analysis and some thoughts, and maybe some of the more esoteric stuff that isn't newsy but is still super interesting. So please do feel free to sign up for that if it's of interest.
don't feel any shame at being salesy, Ben. That your latest your December insights is a completely devilish issue. I was trying to go to bed actually, and I was researching, this podcast. I was researching you as a guest at sometime a few weeks ago. My Lord, I didn't go to bed at 2 a.m. Your insights were so damn insightful, and I just couldn't stop reading the links that you posted in there. So, listeners, absolutely, you have to head to Impetus Insights. I think it's one per month, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a monthly newsletter that basically Ben rounds up about all kinds of research from across the globe, not just the UK. So yes, we will look forward very attentively to the January insights. I'm sure that will be completely different from the December insights. That's how fast things move here in education in the UK, apparently.
And now a brief word from last week's guest, Samantha McMahon, whose episode you can catch after this.
Hi, I'm Samantha McMahon, and what I enjoyed about being a guest on the Qualified Tutor podcast is that it feels very much like a relaxed conversation. Ludo's a really great host and he always puts you at ease. What I reaffirmed about myself was that there is no one way to run a business, and that's what makes it really, really exciting. Something I would say to a future guest is to just completely be yourself, because Ludo is a great person to bounce off, but also Qualified Tutors as an organisation, they like to challenge common perceptions and traditions, so don't be afraid to do that.
Ben, we have time for one more question, and that question is, what's next for you? What's next for Ben Gadsby?
Well, I'm really lucky that I really enjoy my job and I get to be super nerdy on a daily basis and work with awesome people. I want to do some more of the long-term thinking on the National Tutoring Programme. I think there's lots of people that are getting sort of bogged down in the kind of day-to-day, is this working in schools now, and the kind of the immediate future. But I think there is something about going back to that original vision about where do we want to be with tutoring in 4 or 5 years' time. As Impetus, we always have lots of kind of exciting irons in the fire, slightly too many irons in the fire, perhaps. But we've just done some research on kind of social and emotional learning, which I'm really interested in because it's such a controversial area. But it feels like the kind of the readiness to learn bit is the kind of the other side of the coin to tutoring. Like the tutoring is the kind of super academic way to improve attainment. But we know there's kind of more to it than that, and trying to really dig into how to do that well and what that could look like is super exciting. I've got a big data project coming towards the end of the year. We've been analysing the kind of the government's admin data set to look at the links between young people's characteristics and their employment outcomes. We've got a new strategy. Our CEO's coming back from maternity leave. So it's all go at Impetus and always super, super exciting. So I'm looking forward to digging my head into more nerdy things and hopefully being involved in something that in 5 years' time is the kind of the next national tutoring programme, whatever that looks like. That's the plan, insofar as there is a plan.
Yeah, and we don't know what that looks like yet. So that's the exciting part. Yeah, well, as Ben says, exactly, impetus.org.uk to find out all you need to about Impetus and to find Ben's Impetus Insights. You can, of course, connect with Ben on LinkedIn as well. All of those links will be in the show notes. But Ben, thank you so much for joining us, for taking your time this morning to come on. It's been a long episode in the waiting. We've been following Impetus' journey ever since we began as an organisation. So thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Great. Well, that has been the 147th episode of this podcast. Next week, we'll be speaking to Emma Palastanga, who is a researcher as well in education, an author as well. She just released a book called A Creative Primary Curriculum for All. So we will be picking the ideas, picking apart and analysing the ideas from Emma's wonderful book in that episode. So, we will see you all next week. But for one final time, thank you very much, Ben, and see you listeners next time. Cheerio.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Qualified Tutor Podcast. Your next step is to check out the Love Tutoring community, and in particular, Love Tutoring Community Connect, a new premium membership space which will serve all your subject-specific CPD needs alongside a friendly, professional community space that meets regularly. Visit qualifiedtutor.org/transformational-training to find out more about our CPD accredited Level 2 safeguarding and Ofqual recognised courses, the first of their kind in the tutoring industry. See you there.